Hello, welcome once again to another message from First Christian Church in Beaver, Oklahoma. Terry Engler here, and thank you for joining me today. We are approaching the Thanksgiving holiday, which pretty much is explanatory. It's a time when we should give thanks, but in my own way of thinking, every day should be a day of Thanksgiving. So today I want to talk to you about having gratitude for the goodness of God. I figured out as a result of being married to my wife Brenda that in order for something to be looked at as being beautiful or attractive, contrast is important. Now that may be a confusing statement to you, so let me just explain it in terms that apply to me and that I can understand. You see, I've always thought that when I'm picking out clothes to wear for the day, my shirt should be the same color as my pants, right? Well, what I've learned from Brenda over the years is, yes, the shirt does need to have the same color in it as the pants, but it also needs some contrasting colors in order to make it attractive. Yeah, I know some of you are thinking to yourselves, is he really that dumb? But you have to understand, I grew up with a mother that bought my clothes for me with the means of trying to match my red hair. And yes, it used to be red. But you can understand, that's the way I thought things should always be when you try to match things, the same color. Now here's why I share that silly example with you. It seems to me that appreciation, gratitude, is often related to contrasts. The beauty of art is just not in the color, but in the contrast of the colors. Now, that idea of contrast is not only apparent in art or in the clothes that we wear. I found that it exists in practically every area of life, including those things that we take for granted. Let me give you another silly example. Have you ever noticed that often you don't appreciate something until you don't have it any longer? I know I have. When we lived in Liberal years ago, we had a house that was on the edge of town, which means that we were always subjected to the strong south winds that always blow in Kansas. And we had a storm door on the side of our house that faced the south and the door that we used to enter the house. Well, on several occasions, I found myself walking out of that door and just taking for granted that the door closer on the storm door would automatically shut the door. It didn't. Now, I'm sure I replaced 5 or 6 door closers during the time that we lived there, because rather than the door closing, the south wind would catch it, blow it open until the shaft on the door closer would bend, making it useless. And again, I know some of you are saying to yourselves, is he really that dumb? Well, maybe. But at least I got this sermon illustration out of it, and here it is. There are a lot of things we learn to appreciate when we no longer have them. I had a door closer until I didn't, 5 or 6 times. Contrast. It's important, I believe, in helping us develop an attitude of gratitude in our lives. College students who come home to visit, they understand contrast. We have 2 older grandsons, one who is now graduated from college and the other who is in the Air Force. And those times in which they get to come visit Gramps and Granny, they understand the contrast between institutional food and Granny's cooking. They've been looking forward to Granny's home cooking. Why? Because the institutional food helped them to appreciate the contrast between that food and Granny's home cooking. When we observe the contrasts in our lives, it will help develop in us an attitude of gratitude and thanksgiving. Now, could it be that at times we appear to be ungrateful simply because there apparently isn't a lot of contrast in our lives? Well, we have a great example of that found in the Gospel of Luke. And it's the story of a man named Simon, who's a Pharisee, the religious people of that day, and a sinful woman. And it's found in Luke chapter number 7, and I want to begin reading in verse number 36 and read all the way through verse number 47. Here's the way the story goes. Now, one of the Pharisees was requesting Jesus to dine with him, and he entered the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. And there was the woman of that city who was a sinner. And when she learned that Jesus was inclined at the table in Simon's house, the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster vial of perfume, and standing behind him at his feet, she began to weep, and she began to wet his feet with her tears, and she kept wiping his feet with the hair of her head, and kissing his feet, and anointing them with the perfume. Now when the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were truly a prophet, he would know who and what sort of person this woman is who is touching him, that she's a sinner." And Jesus, knowing his thoughts, answered him, saying, "Simon, I have something to say to you." And he said, "Say it, teacher." So Jesus gives him a story. A moneylender had 2 debtors. One owed 500 denarii, or pieces of silver, and the other 50. When they were unable to repay, he graciously forgave them both. So, which of them will love him more, Simon? Well, Simon answered and said, "Well, I suppose the one whom he forgave more." And Jesus said to him, "You have judged correctly." Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I entered your house, and you gave me no water for my feet, but she's wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but since the time I came in, she's not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she's anointed my feet with perfume. And for this reason, I say to you, her sins, which are many, have been forgiven, for she loved much. But who has forgiven little, loves little." Now, let me just break that down a little bit for you, and in terms that we can probably identify with a little bit better. This prominent Pharisee by the name of Simon, and we know he's prominent because he's well-to-do, he's well-liked in the city, he's well-respected, and he's having this banquet to which he has invited Jesus. Now, I may be reading too much into this, but it seems to me that Simon is very concerned about appearances. I get this feeling that part of Simon's motivation for having Jesus come to this banquet was because Jesus was becoming a very well-known teacher and preacher, and people were flocking to Jesus to hear his words. So I have to wonder if perhaps Simon thought, you know what, it would be really helpful to my image in this community if I would invite Jesus, this well-known itinerant preacher, into my home and entertain him. So as we see in the passage, Simon, he doesn't have a real beautiful attitude. He becomes critical. He even second guesses Jesus when Jesus accepts the gratitude of a sinful woman. I mean, can you even imagine trying to pass yourself off as being super spiritual and you're in the presence of Jesus? I mean, he says, if Jesus were a prophet, he could have discerned the kind of woman that she is. So he's also judgmental. He's arrogantly proud. I mean, he says it right out. This woman is a sinner. And then we find this woman. We don't know her name. Some have speculated it might have been Mary Magdalene, but we don't have any proof of that. So we'll just stick with the knowledge that this woman is a sinful woman who's lived a very sinful life. It's quite likely that she was a prostitute. Now, Scripture doesn't confirm that either, but she was prominent in her own life in the sense that whatever she might have been was well known around that town. So she comes into this scene at Simon's house, and you can almost envision the horror that Simon must have felt. He didn't even want someone like her on his property, let alone inside his house. But her attitude is one of humility. We're told that she comes up behind Jesus and she begins to weep and wash his feet with her tears. You see, in that culture, people would recline at a table to eat and they would lay with their feet behind them. So just imagine this scene of this well-known woman, for all the wrong reasons, coming into this well-known religious person's house. I have to wonder if her sinful ways had perhaps caused her to behave differently in her past. But now she replaces any of her former behaviors with humility. And notice the way that she honors Jesus. Again, she wipes his feet with her hair and kisses his feet. This woman who's been used and abused by other men is now expressing an attitude of honor just to be at the feet of Jesus. Notice also, if you will, her spiritual extravagance. In gratitude, she pours the perfume on the feet of Jesus, anointing his feet with it, giving her very best to Jesus. Now, do you see the contrast in her life? Do you see the lack of contrast in Simon's life? You see, Simon, he's always been this good person. He's always had whatever it was that he might have needed. Things have always gone well in his life. He's become a pillar of that community. But that's not the case with this sinful woman. There's a lot of contrast in her life. And Simon resents her breaking into the middle of this special dinner, a banquet that he's hosting for Jesus, and as well as the others who have come along with him. But Jesus stops. And he said, and I'm going to paraphrase this for better understanding. He says, Simon, I want to teach you a lesson. You need to learn a lesson in contrast. Your problem is that you don't have a whole lot of contrast in your life. And the reason this woman is so grateful is because she has a lot of contrast in her life. Now, there are some important lessons here that I want to share with you today. And the first is this. Jesus wants to teach Simon the importance of understanding. Now, I'm sure those of you who handle the finances in your home, do the bookkeeping in your home, you figured this out, but if you spend money and don't keep records of your spending, it's easy to develop a false sense of security, right? And I believe that there are a lot of people who handle their finances in that way. They don't like to face the fact that perhaps they're overspending. And that's why credit cards have become so popular in our culture today. Because it's easy not to have to face reality with using credit cards because you don't have to pay for what you're purchasing at the time. But there will always be a day of reckoning when you do that. Now, I say that to make this point. To live without a true understanding of the state of your affairs is a dangerous place to live. We need to have an understanding about ourselves and about our situation. And the story that Jesus uses to illustrate this truth from this passage is about two people who have a debt. And they're both indebted to the same person, and neither were able to repay it. one debt's much larger than the other. And the man who lent them this money decides to forgive both of them their debt. Now Jesus asked Simon, Simon, who do you think is going to appreciate having their debt forgiven more? Simon says, well, that's easy. The person who's forgiven much will appreciate it more than the person who's been forgiven little. He's going to be more grateful. Jesus said, Simon, you are right. Both had a debt, and neither could repay it. But your problem, Simon, is that while this woman obviously has a debt of sin, you also have a debt, and it's also a debt of sin. She realizes her sin, her indebtedness, but you don't. You believe, oh, I'm a good person. Things are all good in my life. I'm walking with the Lord. Things are going well in my family. We're all doing well. But Simon, what you don't realize is that you're in debt too. You know, I believe here in America we have developed that false sense of security. We have a potentially failing economy, an out of control national debt, even a morally declining culture. And yet none of those things are our biggest danger here in America. I believe our biggest danger that we face is believing that we are invincible, that we're above all of that stuff. This feeling that nothing can ever destroy us, that's our biggest danger. Why? Because too many feel that because we are Americans, we are Christians. Or because we live in the greatest nation on the face of the earth, that God's blessing is always going to be upon us because we're a Christian nation. Friends, that is not true any longer. We believe that since we've been exposed to things that are good and right and noble, that we're invincible. We're not prone to fall into all of those other things that are not good and not right and have no honor to them. Well, over time, that feeling of security, if you want to call it that, has brought us to the point where even sin doesn't look nearly as awful as it once did to us. And I can offer proof of that in my own life. You see, I was saved at a very young age, the age of 9, meaning I never really did anything all that terrible in my life. I mean, I've never killed or stolen from anyone. I've never taken advantage of someone sexually. So the danger for me is in my struggle with feelings of self-righteousness and pride, right? There hasn't been a whole lot of contrast in my life. Now, I'm not saying I should have gone out and lived this careless, sinful life just so I could have some contrast. I'm saying the answer is for me to understand that self-righteousness and pride stink every bit as much as lying or murder or any other sin for that matter. The problem is that you and I, is not that you and I need to go out and do something to create some contrast in our lives. The problem is we already have the contrast. We just don't see it and we don't understand it. We need to recognize that apart from Jesus Christ, we are nothing. And I believe that gratitude grows out of an attitude of being unworthy, undeserving, and then we understand and appreciate the goodness of Jesus, who takes our feelings of unworthiness and makes us worthy as a result of His righteousness, not ours. And He gives that to us in exchange for our sinfulness. What a trade. Now you may be thinking, Terry, do you really believe that gratitude grows out of an attitude of unworthiness? Yes. If we understand that it's Jesus who has made us worthy. Well, you're still thinking, Terry, that's not a good thing to preach because there are many people who already feel beaten down and unworthy, people who have a poor self-esteem, just like that woman that you're talking about at Simon's house. Listen, friends, the only thing that will adequately deal with a poor self-esteem is the recognition that that your low self-esteem is the result of sin in your life. And the only person who can restore that self-esteem is Jesus Christ in his goodness, pouring his love into your life. This woman had that understanding. She knew she had a debt. And Jesus is saying to them, both of you have an obligation. But Simon, she's the only one who has recognized, understood, and accepted her obligation. Jesus says, Simon, what did you do when I came into your house? You did nothing. What has this woman done? When you didn't pour water to clean my feet, as is the custom, she wet my feet with her tears. And when you didn't wipe my feet with a towel after having washed them, she wiped them dry with her hair. When you didn't greet me with a customary kiss of greeting on my cheek, she's now kissing my feet. When you didn't pour oil on my head to moisten my dry skin from walking in the dust and the dirt, she poured perfume on my feet. Simon, think about this. This woman isn't used to weeping. She's not used to kissing feet. She's used to other kinds of kissing. This woman has a past that doesn't relate to what she's doing at this very moment. But Simon, she's doing all the things that you should have done as my host, and yet you didn't. She felt an obligation out of her unworthiness, and she understood and accepted it. But Simon, you too had an obligation, but out of your self-righteousness, you haven't even recognized it, let alone understood it. You see, the tragedy that Jesus wants Simon to understand is that so many times it's possible to fail to understand the contrast between our lives and the lives of others. All Simon could see was this woman's past. He couldn't understand what she was now doing, but neither could he see his self-righteousness in contrast to the beauty of her humility and the acts that her humility brought her to do. All he could see was her awful past and his glorious one. Friends, if you and I are going to be grateful today, we're going to have to recognize not only God's grace given to us when we've messed up, and in his mercy, and in his mercy took us to himself, even when we had failed to accept our unworthiness. When we see that contrast, we will then become grateful. And the second lesson, I believe, is the importance of perspective and wisdom. Not only does Jesus talk about the importance of understanding, he talks about the importance of a proper perspective. I believe that gratitude grows out of our view of things. It's plainly obvious in the lesson of Simon and the woman here in Luke 7. She has a right perspective of herself. She sees and knows the true nature of sin and its effects in her life. Simon doesn't. She can recognize the awful things that she's done. She knows those things that have been harmfully imposed upon her. She sees the true nature of sin. But Simon doesn't, because his self-righteousness has blinded himself to the contrast between him and a sinless and perfect Jesus. She didn't. But that's what kept Simon from really having gratitude in his heart. We have to recognize that sin is sin. That self-righteousness is as terrible as wicked sin, and we're all bankrupt without Jesus. Let me just ask you a quick question. What is worse? A tornado that wipes out a town, or poison in the water system that slowly destroys the population of the town? What's worse? Oh, we're more awestruck, more terror-stricken, more torn by the effects of a tornado. We're much more likely to assist with the victims of a tornado. But is a tornado any worse than poison in the water system? Not really. Another question in light of that. What is worse? The awful, wicked deeds of this world, or the cancerous self-righteousness that eats away at the heart of so many people, sending them to eternal destruction? And it will. Our problem is our failure to have perspective in our lives. Those failures that God in His goodness has delivered us from, as well as those that He wants us to succeed at in our lives. We need a proper perspective. This woman saw the fruit of her sin. That is what sin had done in her life. Well, when we get a real view of our true condition, we will become grateful because we will see what Jesus has brought us out of. If there aren't these big contrasts in our life, that doesn't mean we can't have gratitude toward God. You don't have to have the contrast of having committed sin and then becoming a beautiful child of God. You don't have to have that kind of contrast. But if you understand the true nature of sin and its consequences, in other words, have a proper perspective of your sinfulness, whatever that sinfulness might be, and you come to Jesus and say, "Thank you, Jesus, for saving my soul," then you can develop an attitude of gratitude. And that brings me to another thing that I see in this story. It wasn't just this woman's understanding of and her sorrow for her sin and the perspective that she had that brought her to that knowledge. It was also her passion. She not only saw the devastating results of her sin, she saw the beautiful healing power of the goodness of God's gift of grace. Not only the true nature of her sin, she saw the true nature of Jesus' love. She had undoubtedly loved many men in her past. She'd probably spent an entire lifetime looking for love. But for the first time in her life, she finds real love in the person of Jesus. Her acts of love shown to Him, they're not a sensual, sexual kind of love. For the first time in her life, she's found what real love is, and she understands the contrasts between the two. The problem is that Simon didn't. In fact, I'm guessing he probably never paid much attention to love. He's been too busy using people and coercing them to serve his own purposes. So for Simon to understand the love that she's showing Jesus was a very difficult thing. She's a woman who's been rejected, but is now accepted by the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. She's a woman who has been discouraged and beaten down, told that she had no value whatsoever. But now she's been raised up and encouraged, lifted up by the goodness of this man whose name is Jesus. So how could she help but be thankful? I mean, this bottle of expensive perfume that she's pouring on Jesus' feet, that wasn't even enough to express the kind of love she felt for Jesus. It was a passionate love. So she gave Jesus all that she had. She saw the fruit of Jesus' love. And I'm certain that this woman had spent many sleepless nights feeling the emptiness, the void, the frustration, the bitterness of sin. But Simon hadn't, because he couldn't even acknowledge his own sin. She knew what it was to be forgiven. Jesus said, "I forgive you." And for the first time in her life, the craving inside her heart was satisfied. Can you understand that the contrasts in life can make us grateful? I want to thank you for joining me today, but even more than thanking you, I want you to understand the importance of being thankful this Thanksgiving season, and not just on Thanksgiving Day, but every day throughout the year. Thank you for joining me today. Have a great Thanksgiving, and I will see you next time.